So this is where we left off yesterday, and I hope that you already have this filled in, but if for whatever reason you didn't yesterday, you should. Could somebody tell me what type of tissue would come from the ectoderm germ layer? Yes. So she said skin, nails, what were your other things? So if you think about this first line of stuff, it's stuff that's attached to your skin, stuff that's near your skin or stuff that is your skin. It's the outside layer of you. And conveniently, that's what ecto means in ectoderm. So we're talking about the outer layer. Now there's another pretty important thing that comes from the ectoderm. We did an entire chapter or two on it. Yeah? So the nervous system, along with sensory organs, so that was chapter 11 and 12, two entire chapters. This is the part of the germ layers that those tissues arise from. There are a few other things that are on the list. For example, it mentions the pituitary and the adrenal medulla, but I would argue those are part of the nervous system anyways. So I don't think that I need to add them to the list because they're part of that bigger category, nervous system and sensory organs. Typically, if a question is asking you about the ectoderm, they're going to focus on the skin or something that's attached to skin or on the nervous system. Those are the two main categories of structures that come from the ectoderm. Now, if we look at mesoderm, it's talking about middle. Anyone want to tell us what some of the mesoderm tissues are? Yeah. Okay, so she mentioned things like the dermis of your skin. That's not the outer layer, but the sublayer. So the epidermis is on the outside. Then there are layers underneath that. So it's not on the outside, but closer to the middle. Then she mentioned blood vessels, so the lining of blood vessels, body cavities. I'd like to specifically mention muscles. You have lots of types of muscles. Your heart is a muscle, and I'm mentioning that because that is frequently something that comes up as being associated with the mesoderm. The other thing that's often associated with this is the reproductive organs. Now, if you look, it also mentions excretory system organs like the kidney, the ureter, the spleen. Those are all on that list, but that's getting a little particular. If we look at these big categories, the lower layer of your skin, blood vessels, muscles, and reproductive organs, those are the main things that would be asked about as coming from the mesoderm. Now, if we consider endoderm, endo meaning inside, we would expect the lining of a lot of different body parts to be made of endoderm. So anywhere you have a tract, like your respiratory tract or your digestive tract, that has a lining on the inside of it, that would come from the endoderm. A lot of digestive organs come from the endoderm. So it mentions specifically liver, pancreas as coming there. And a lot of structures that are in your throat come from the endoderm. So if you look at the list, it mentions thymus, tonsils, parathyroid, thyroid. So these are some examples of tissue that comes from each germ layer. Like I said yesterday, most of the time, the question would be, here are two germ layers, what tissues come from them? Or, here are some tissues, which germ layer did it come from? That's the basic setup for most of the questions. Now, I mentioned, or I added to my little title there, stem cells. And I just want to come back to the idea of a stem cell, because when we talked about the cell cycle way back in the beginning, we touched on them briefly. But the ectoderm is made up of stem cells. The mesoderm is made up of stem cells. And the endoderm is also made up of stem cells. Why would we call them stem cells? Because as soon as they're formed, they don't look like skin and nails and the nervous system yet. They are still a cell that hasn't quite decided what it's going to be. They're a little more specific than the original stem cell from which the zygote came. So all three of these came from an original type of stem cell, but we would still call the ectoderm, mesoderm, and endoderm stem cells because at this point, they have not become any of these yet. That's still got to happen over time. Now, does anyone want to ask anything about the germ layers here? Okay. So the next thing on the list is neurulation and organ formation. This is something that's happening during the third week. So week 1 was the egg got fertilized, made its way to the uterus, and implanted. Week 2 was gastrulation, so the formation of those germ layers. This is week 3. In week 3, the nervous system starts to form, and organs start to form as well. If we take a look at the picture that's here, and I put this little picture in your study guide as well, we are looking here at ectoderm. So it's like we've zoomed in on just one of the layers of our cell that has gone through gastrulation, and we're just looking at the ectoderm. The ectoderm folds, as you can see here and here, in a really similar way to how the blastocyst started folding in on itself. The ectoderm folds so that you end up with two layers. One that's on the outside, the epidermis, so your skin, and one that's on the inside, the neural tube, which is going to eventually develop into the nervous system. So one of the germ layers, the ectoderm, will fold again. And then because it folded, now I have two different layers. That's how it becomes both the skin and the nervous system. Now, if you look at the bottom, I just repeated the picture that we had before of what it looked like during gastrulation, how you had those three layers, to show you what all of this folding would start to look like overall. It starts to get really hard to draw all of this infolding. What you're responsible for knowing is that neurulation is when the ectoderm folds to become both the skin and the beginning of the nervous system. Now, this is the third week, so if I consider what's going on for the woman who may or may not be pregnant here, during this third week, this is probably when she's starting to think, my period's late. Maybe I should check and see if I'm pregnant. But perhaps not. Perhaps she hasn't quite realized yet. Perhaps her cycle isn't regular, or perhaps it's usually a bit longer, and she hasn't realized. Look at all the stuff that's already happened. This developing embryo has already gone through multiple sets of mitosis, so gone through the cell cycle a bunch of times. It's implanted. It has formed three different layers. One of those layers has folded again to start forming the nervous system. During this third week, because I mentioned organ formation, on about day 18, that's when the heart starts to form. So during this third week, we got the nervous system forming, and the heart will start forming in the mesoderm as well. So she may or may not even know she's pregnant, and the baby's got a heart already. Does anyone want to ask anything there? Okay. So if we go on to the next picture, these are called the Carnegie stages. You might see these. I know one of my doctors has a poster kind of like this in his office that show the embryo at different stages of development so that you can get an idea of what it looks like and how big it is. If we look right here, this is around 4 weeks. You can see it says 28 days. So I'm going to go 1 week at a time and just highlight some of the main things that would start to happen. In week 4, things that you will start to see are blood and blood vessels forming. Makes sense because we just formed the heart in the last one. This is where the lungs and the kidneys will start to form. You should also see arm and leg buds. So not a full-grown arm or leg, but a little bud of tissue where the arm and the leg will be developing. And the head will start to distinguish itself. So it is super tiny at this point. If you look at the scale, that's 10 millimeters, and this is smaller than that, so it is minuscule at this point. Now, if we think about 5 weeks, 5 weeks would be kind of in between those two stages there, around 35 days. During the 5th week, that is when the eyes open and the head becomes much larger. Now, the head is the thing that gets largest the quickest. The head is really the biggest part of the baby. If we think about the 6th week, right about here, just after stage 17, in the 6th week, that is when we see the brain really start to develop. Now, we had the beginnings of the nervous system, but a lot of that was not the brain itself, but maybe some of the other structures associated with it. We see leg and arm elongation, and hormones start being produced. Now, right about here, that's 7 weeks. Do this one over here. So during week 7 or around week 7, we start to see organ systems. So not just individual pieces, but the fact that they're working together. So for example, you have a digestive system that's composed of many organs. This is the point where they start working systematically. So we see a lot of coordinated activity. We also see a cartilaginous skeleton. So bones, they're not hard like a bone is yet, but they're there and they're forming. And when we get to this stage, that's 8 weeks. Now, if you consider the scale that's on the picture, it looks bigger here because, of course, I've enlarged the picture, but realistically, at 8 weeks, it is the size of a paperclip. So imagine a little metal paperclip. That is about how big the baby is at this point. But, well, oh, my reindeer ears are messing things up. 90% of structures have started to form. So it's super tiny, but it has basically all of the pieces. From this point onward, instead of developing new structures, all that's going to happen is that they get more sophisticated or that they get bigger. But if you look, we've got all the systems on the go. It's got a nervous system, it's got a digestive system, an excretory system. They're not ready, they're not big enough, and they're not developed enough for the baby to survive, but they are all there at that point. Now, does anyone want to ask anything about these stages? So if you notice, there was an entire slide just about the first week, an entire slide just about the second week, an entire slide just about the third week, because that is when most of the big things happen. We summed up weeks 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8 all on one slide, and you'll see a bit later, we're going to sum up the entire rest of the pregnancy by giving some very general descriptions of new things that happen. But at this point, all the stuff has happened. Cells have become different types of cells. The baby has organ systems, and they are working together. Now, there are some structures that are necessary to support this little embryo so that it can go from being the size of a paperclip to the size of a baby. Now, these support structures, I want you to remember, most of them are coming from the same cell that the baby came from. So if you remember that blastocyst, most of these structures have come from the cells that were part of the blastocyst. Now, if we start over on the side with the chorion, hopefully you can see that if I were to look at those layers in a relative way, the chorion is the outer layer. So we'll put chorion, we'll call it number 1. So if you're asked to identify something on a picture, the outermost layer of tissue surrounding the embryo is going to be the chorion. It forms the fetal side of the placenta. So if I follow that chorion all the way around, so it's this external layer here, and I come down here, there are these little structures that look like little trees, I think, little upside down trees. Those are extensions of the chorion. So down here, we'll call this number 2, the chorionic villi. Now, hopefully you're like, hey, I've heard the word villi before. Where did I hear that? My digestive system. I have villi in my intestines. And the point of the villi in your intestines is to give you a large surface area so that you can absorb all of the digestive food that's moving through your intestines. So the chorionic villi provide surface area for exchange of nutrients and waste with the mother. So just like the villi in your intestines help your digestive system exchange things with your blood, the chorionic villi help the mother exchange things with the baby. Now, does anyone want to ask anything about the chorion or the chorionic villi? Okay. We'll take a look at the amnion next. I'll call that number 3. The amnion is a transparent sac filled with fluid. If you look, it is not the outermost layer, but it's further inside from the chorion, so you can use that to distinguish it. It surrounds and protects the embryo. Now, perhaps some of you have heard of something called an amnio or an amniocentesis. Has anyone heard of that or maybe know what that is? So we can do something called an amniocentesis. This is a sampling of this fluid. So it's a procedure that might be done while a woman is pregnant to try to detect issues that might be going on with the embryo. Because the fluid directly surrounds the embryo, you can pick up on levels of different substances and get an idea of the health of the embryo. Now, if we continue down here, we'll talk about these two together, the allantois and the yolk sac. If you look at them, they are right next to each other. So these two structures in number 4 help form the umbilical cord. They will eventually contribute to the digestive system. But very specifically, they have no nutritive function in humans. And I'm mentioning this because we're going to look at a thought lab in a few minutes. And the thought lab is going to compare what's going on with human support structures versus other species. Maybe if you look at the word, especially the one yolk sac, you might say, well, I've heard the word yolk before. Where would you find a yolk? In an egg, right? So we don't produce hard-shelled eggs with our offspring in it. The offspring stay inside the mother's body until they're ready to be born, but lots of species lay eggs. And the yolk sac becomes really important for providing nutrition to the developing embryo. Not for humans here, but in other species, yes. Now, if we take a look, the next 2 points are talking about the placenta. And so I want to go to the slide that has the picture of the placenta stuff on it so we can look at it more clearly. So before I do, does anyone want to ask any questions there? Oh yeah, I should mention this. This also contributes to the excretory system. So things like bladder, urethra. And if you look, it's the thing that's connecting the baby to the placenta. So it's how food gets in and waste gets out. And so it makes sense that those tissues that form the umbilical cord would contribute to the baby's digestive and excretory system. Now these two pictures really are of the same thing, but they're showing a zoomed in view of the placenta. Now if I could just tell you right here, that's the umbilical cord. And it's the same on both pictures. Hopefully you can see in the umbilical cord that there are vessels running through it. There are fetal veins and a fetal artery. Fetal is referring to a fetus. So it's the artery and the veins that lead to and from the fetus. Now, if you look at what's happening, these blood vessels come down here, but they don't ever touch the mother's blood. This would be the mother's blood, and these would have fetal blood. You'll notice that the vessels that contain fetal blood run directly next to the structures that have the mother's blood, but they don't actually ever mix. However, you might remember that things can move in and out of blood vessels because blood vessels have walls that allow for exchange. So anywhere there is fetal blood close to the mother's blood, things could be moving in and out of those blood streams. So things could move from the fetal veins into the mother's blood, or things could move from the mother's blood into the baby's blood, not because the blood is actually mixing, but because of diffusion. So the placenta allows exchange, usually via diffusion, so diffusion across cell membranes, between mother and baby. And so some examples of this exchange would be things like nutrition. So, baby needs food. Mother is going to provide it, typically in the form of glucose or some other sugar like that. So as the baby's blood passes through these blood vessels next to the mother's blood in the placenta, glucose could diffuse from the mother's blood to the baby's. It could be excretory. So for example, urea. The baby could be producing urea, and it could diffuse from the baby's blood into the mother's so the mother could get rid of it. Certainly respiratory. So we're talking oxygen and CO2 exchange. If you take a look at the second picture, I know mine's colored and yours isn't, but perhaps you remember that where the blood looks a little bluer, there's less oxygen, and where it looks a little redder, there's more oxygen. And so it's trying to illustrate that after the baby's blood passes by the mother's blood, it will have gotten rid of usually some of its CO2 and will have absorbed some of the oxygen from the mother's blood. It could certainly be endocrine, so we're talking about hormones. Now there's one particular hormone that's being produced in the placenta. It is called HCG. It's one of the ones that's on your data sheet. HCG stands for human chorionic gonadotropin. And now that I've told you what the chorion is, you might say, oh, okay. The placenta is formed on the baby's side by the chorion, so that's where the name is coming from. The little h for human, like how growth hormone has a little h. And gonadotropin because it's going to stimulate reproductive structures to make other hormones. Now, HCG, this particular hormone, this is the one that a pregnancy test would be trying to detect. HCG has as its function to maintain levels of estrogen and progesterone. So we just said when we reviewed the quest that when estrogen and progesterone decrease because the corpus luteum has degenerated, well then that is when the cycle starts again and the woman would have her period. If those levels can be maintained, the uterus stays thick and she doesn't have her period again. If those levels are high, remember they have negative feedback on GnRH, so we don't have a new cycle starting. We don't have FSH stimulating another follicle to develop. Does anyone want to ask anything about the placenta here? This is where we're going to stop in the study guide, and we are going to take a quick look at something that's in your textbook.